was emailed to you, HCO, which Jim Heckman and I direct, is engaged in a large-scale and multi-year research program involving scholars throughout the world, focusing on basically every aspect of inequality, but with, I think, some particular concern about issues of mobility, both within the life course and across generations. In this endeavor, our hope is at the end of 5 years that we'll have some vision of a comprehensive, relatively comprehensive explanation of aspects of mobility, and so this group is convened in the spirit of that, both to share research across disciplines, perspectives, disagreements, and hopefully identification of synergies and collaboration, as well as to help give guidance to what HCO does across time. I should, I think, thank the Institute for New Economic Thinking for funding, and I think there's a mistake at conferences, which is they always thank the real powers at the end, and I want to do it at the beginning. HCO would not function without its Chief Operating Officer, which is Allison Ballas. I just want to thank you for organizing everything. So without further ado, the first session's objective, roughly speaking, was to talk about population aggregates and broad questions of the role of genetic factors in macro level phenomena. And so, Greg Cochran, the floor is yours. So the idea is everybody speaks for 12 minutes, and then we can talk/argue.
That sounds about right to me. So I'm Greg Cochran. I'm loosely associated with the University of Utah and more closely with Henry. And I'm just going to give a few grand generalities about genetics and influence on behavior, and then people will argue with me. Okay, I'm quoting Turkheimer here with one slight addition. Eric Turkheimer said, first law, all human behavior traits are heritable. Close to true. Second law, the effect of being raised in the same family is smaller than the effect of genes. Generally true. Again, in the situations people have looked at. Third law, a substantial portion of the variation in complex human behavioral traits is not accounted for by the additive effects of genes or families. There's important things, unknown things, that seem to influence human behavior that are not obviously genetic or familial. Fourth law, which is somebody extended Turkheimer's stuff, genetic variants that are common in a population of very small individual effects of behavioral traits. For example, that means on things like IQ, there's no single gene that explains a lot of the total variance. There can be genes with strong effects, but they're not common. Now, this is not a fundamental law of nature, because you can look at other species in which there may be behavioral traits which are strongly affected by having a particular locus or not, but this has not been seen in human studies at this point. In fact, in some of those other species, for example, there are species that have different kinds of males, male morphs, and sometimes that boils down to the state of a single allele. It's like a switch that says, you will have perhaps a male that puts a lot of effort into investment in mating effort, another one which they call sneaky fuckers, which sneak up on the other ones after they've attracted mates. That can sometimes be a simple genetic switch. And there are species like that in which some of them show multiple male morphs and another subpopulation may not show them. So the point is, I don't know that we'll ever see anything like this in humans, but the fourth law is it's an observation. It's not something that absolutely has to be that way. Another thing is that Strong's, so we're sort of talking about genetic architecture, the distribution of genes that influence the behavior, it can, or anything else, that can change under selection, which is another reason it can be different in subpopulations. For example, in the populations that have mostly been looked at, there's, no single gene explains a lot of the variance in height. Maybe at the most 1% for the strongest such influence. But there are other populations that seem to have genes which have larger effects, pygmies, for example. So this is probably a good rule generally. When you say something about a population, you can't always extend it to the next population. People have done a lot of work with heritability of behavioral traits with twin studies, and there was always criticisms of them. I didn't take the criticisms too seriously, but there are new ways of looking at these that look at overall genetic resemblance, and it looks like the twin studies are basically correct. How do things change? Selection. Selection changes gene frequencies and changes phenotypes. Every society selects for something. There's always certain genes that induce certain phenotypic traits. Those traits affect reproduction and survival. And so certain things are favored in any given society, not always the same things. And I say usually unintended. That means I couldn't think of any example where it was intended, but there may be somebody who shaped things in a way they intended to. But I don't know of a solid case for one. People have shaped things. Culture can shape things, but it's usually just, happens. Partly because this takes long enough, it'd be hard for anybody to make up their mind to influence it in a given direction deliberately. It's talking about the breeder's equation, which is your basic simple-minded model of how this works. If you have a population and the people who reproduce are different on average in some trait than the general population from which they're drawn, that's S, the selection differential. Like, so suppose the people who had children were one standard deviation taller than average. Then their children will also be taller, but not as much as them. So the change is essentially that original differential times the narrow sense heritability in that environment, which can change. The heritability is a function of particular environments. But one of the things people don't always realize is, suppose you did such a thing. Suppose you founded a colony full of people who are one standard deviation taller than average. And let's suppose the narrow sense heritability of height is, 0.7, something like that. The next generation would be somewhat taller, 7/10 of a standard deviation. And if there were no other selective factors, so would the next. See, these changes can build up. They can last. If they weren't, we wouldn't have dairy cows. Selection can be fast or slow. Here I'm talking about humans. If it's bacteria, it can happen in a day. But it is possible, and we think there probably have been some cases where there have been interesting changes on the order of like a standard deviation or something like that, half a standard deviation, could happen in less than 1,000 years, which might be about 40 generations. Now, the maximum time available, for which modern humans have been separated and could have gone in different directions, is something like 100,000. That's actually sort of still, that's not an exact number. That might be 50% longer, might be only 50,000 years, something like that. But there is some evidence of a very simple kind. This is from some work by Dan Friedman, who used to be at the University of Chicago. He looked at behavioral differences of babies at birth, and they're there. In fact, I really ought to borrow Steve Chu for this, except he's no longer 24 hours old. But for example, if you do an annoying thing to a Chinese baby by basically pinching its nose shut, they just go along with it. They don't yell at you. They just breathe through their mouth. Caucasian babies, African babies, they get mad. And it's unlikely this is culturally induced when they're 24 hours old. There's a video now on YouTube that actually shows movies of this. Friedman's original work was with dogs. He wanted to see, are the characteristics of dogs something that are taught or are they just innate? And he found out, to everybody's surprise, that wire-haired terriers will try to bite you when they're 3 weeks old, and black labs, don't. He had the puppies raised by mothers of a different breed, but it didn't influence their behavior. So there are innate tendencies, some at least, that can be different in different human populations. Some of these things apply to smaller groups. Like selection is the main thing that changes populations. You can talk about classes. Classes can be somewhat genetically different. They can change to some extent by selection, but probably to a very large extent by differential recruitment. Some people who have certain qualities are more likely to get into a certain class of people or to fall out of that class of people. Chance, of course, matters too. But differential recruitment is a big factor in this sort of thing. And when you talk about are people with in a given job, let's say taller or shorter, smarter or dumber, whatever, that's essentially all differential recruitment as far as I can see. Which is, it is not because, basketball players, they get the job because they're tall, roughly speaking. Distributions. One of the interesting things is that modest differences in the mean can make big differences at the extremes, and that's just a function of typical distributions that are more or less kind of like a Gaussian distribution. So for example, suppose you had a population that was a standard deviation better at certain things like long distance running. I'm doing okay. One thing that helps that is, for example, being, say, adapted to high altitudes. That, like people in Ethiopia, less so in Kenya, but Ethiopia it actually gets fairly high. But even then, that's not enough because there's other people who adapted to high altitudes, like Tibetans, who are not famously good at long distance running, partly because their legs are not very long. But the point is, some populations are better at doing the marathon, and they can be so much better that at the very extreme, the best in the world, that they may always win, even compared to much larger populations. So when you start seeing marathons and they say the winners are Ethiopian, Kenyan, 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 Ethiopian, Ethiopian, Ethiopian. The top two Ethiopians are, cousins, and so forth from a certain area. It's not that they have better coaches and bigger track facilities. They are better at it. I mean, you can have a village in Ethiopia that can beat, at this event, everyone in China. But the point is, the difference on average is not so big, but at the extremes, the people who are 5 standard deviations out, the Olympic winners, all may come from a group that's actually fairly small, but has a higher mean. For populations to diverge, they have to be genetically isolated, basically. If you have very much genetic mixing between groups, it levels out differences. It's very effective. I mean, for example, if you had a population that was being under moderately strong selection for, let's say, height, but then they intermarried to an extent of 2% a generation with another neighboring population that was not, they would only get a little bit taller and it would stop. You need genetic isolation for differences to accumulate. And the usual way is simply being far apart. Once in a while, people have social rules that keep them from marrying other people who may be nearby, and that can allow this also. That's probably not as common, but it does happen. Epigenetic inheritance. Epigenetics are changes in genes other than in the fundamental nucleotides. They happen. I mean, when a particular sort of human cell becomes a muscle cell, certain changes are made, and those changes are replicated. The descendants of muscle cells are muscle cells. Generally, these markers are sort of erased in the reproductive cells, and things are reset to the proper beginnings again. There are known cases, not very common, where this does not always happen. There are a few cases known in mice, which is where it's been well studied, where the epigenetic state of an allele is sometimes inherited into the next generation. As far as we know, all these cases involve basically recent genetic insertions. Something like a retrovirus has been inserted in a particular place. I mean, the most famous one, agouti mice, is from an insertion that actually happened in the 1950s in some mouse line. And in some places, the resetting does not happen properly. Now, other people are saying, well, maybe this explains why something bad happened to my father, grandfather, whatever, and somehow it marked the genes in a way that's hurting or perhaps helping me. I don't believe it. For example, there was a recent study that claimed that they could make mice afraid of a certain scent, and then that was inherited in the next generation. I don't believe it. What would that take? I said, you would have to have the activation state of certain genes in the brain would have to be transmitted to the sperm in a controlled way that then cause things to happen in the next generation. I don't think there's any such mechanism. And I'll tell you, it's more complicated than that because not only that, when you start changing these gene activation patterns, they have to be the right patterns at different times in development. So let's suppose there was a gene that becomes more activated when you, say, learn calculus. Or maybe most likely less activated, but at any rate. the point is that same gene is probably not going to, you wouldn't want it to have a different activation state in early development because that would probably have some bad consequence. See, not only would these changes happen, they would have to be controlled as to what time they occurred. You want it to happen when you're older, not at early stages, which it would probably interfere with something. There's no way for this to happen. So adaptive transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, I don't think it exists. But a lot of people would like it to exist. Well, I have a long list of things I would like to exist, but most of them don't. Okay, so my comment, forget about it. Human capital formation. Since the ultimate purpose of here is we're trying to communicate with economists, and I for one believe that the geneticist and the economist should be friends, that the usual model, and it's not something I know a lot about, this is my impression, I'd be happy to be corrected. The usual model is that human capital is to some extent a product of parental investment, and that if they have fewer kids, they can invest more. And I can think of cases in which that would be true, or which at least would be practical. But to the extent that some of the qualities that the kids get are genetically transmitted, then in those cases it shouldn't matter how many kids you have. They're all getting the same genetic transmission. So to the extent that human capital is formed by attending, let's say, a certain expensive education, then fewer would be better. But to the extent that some of the differences between people are genetic, and some kids may be better at things because of their heredity, again, part of the explanation, that part of it should not really go down with the number of children. So just as an example, that the genetics has different implications than some other things. And I made this short because I wanted people to be able to not fall asleep, talk to people, etc. Ask me questions, tell me I'm wrong, whatever you want.
Paper published in Nature Neuroscience this week. This is the new trendy thing that we actually was talking about this as event last November. This is something nobody was expecting. Male mouse sperm contains RNA that, yes, can actually change gene expression pretty much from birth in the offspring. It's the only transmission mechanism that would be possible because it doesn't, as you point out, involve, keeping the marks in the germline cells.
It would still be kind of a trick.
Oh, well, so the thing is that their argument is that it is a trick. You're only going to see it in situations where it would have high adaptive value, and then we trail off because we don't know how it works. But at least now we know that something like this does work. I have no idea how important it's going to be. I know when you said it's not likely to be hugely important because how how could that possibly be? But there is now a mechanism. This is one of those weird things about molecular biochemistry. It's like, if there's any way something could happen,
I know.
It'll happen. But,
But it's still, you need a mechanism if we're talking about a learning experience. Now, if we were talking about something like starvation, which affects the whole body, I could imagine there would be a change in a state which would be at least somewhat transmitted with RNA.
Sure.
But it's harder for me to imagine how, let's suppose we've taken some mice and run them through a maze, how that information is then transmitted to RNA in the germ cells.
No, I agree. Mouse running, maze running doesn't sound good for this. It would have to be something that would involve,
I could imagine
deprivation or some
starvation.
Stress. Those sorts of things you could imagine.
And really food shortage is something that happens to essentially everybody, every species.
Right.
It sort of comes and goes.
Yeah.
It's not absolutely impossible. Now, that doesn't mean it does happen in humans, but it's not absolutely impossible. But the idea of the thing that people are reaching out for
The
is
systematic differences of exploiting large population is obviously. Yeah.
well, but they're also trying to but sometimes individualistic things. They're saying, I lead a twisted life because my dad grew up in the Depression.
Yeah.
I said, actually, nobody uses that one because so many people did, and so it wouldn't be any fun because it doesn't work. But they're looking for things like that were learned experiences. I said I could imagine it for something like starvation. In a very general way, I could imagine it for if you went from a situation in which infectious disease was a real threat to one in which it was less. Right. I could imagine maybe you're tuning that up and down a little. I mean, I don't actually believe it, but at least I could imagine it. But for learned things, I can't see how it could possibly work.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I couldn't imagine how it could possibly work either until somebody come up with these.
No, but you still have to get stuff transmitted from the brain to the testes.
Absolutely.
And for some people, the separation is not as big as we would hope. But yes.
Don't get me wrong on that. in any sense trying to defend the people who are looking for epigenetics as a big hope for explaining basically everything, as you're saying. But I guess similarly, when somebody comes and says, forget about it, it makes me think we know enough about this now to say that just saying forget about it probably isn't the best.
Yes, our opinions differ. Because
At
I do think
least I
that's.
think we need to keep an open mind about things that especially.
I'm willing to consider possibilities that even I think are crazy, and this is one of them. But I think it's crazy.
Oh, as I said, I'm not trying to defend the people who look at it as a big.
Well, I'm trying to
just-
attack them. Okay, I mean, when that article by the guy who's saying I think the mice have, that we've transmitted hereditary fear, I don't believe it.
Oh, I don't tend to believe those things either, but I think that when you say let's just rule it out the way it appears you're saying, you are in danger of committing the same sin, if you will, as people who are looking for it as the next great hope for explaining everything.
No.
Greg,
I don't have any more.
Yes?
the meme is so powerful and appealing, especially to, say, journalists who cover science, that I think you have to have a measured response to it, because people.
That is my
maybe
measured
people's priority
response.
will be that, yeah, of course that could be true.
Well,
And,
my response is you're an idiot. No, that's my real response. My measured response is forget about it.
The response is not incorrect, but it may not be the most effective response.
I've had that happen.
Yeah.
Yes.
I for one appreciate you throwing the water on the epigenetic inheritance meme. That's a good word for it, particularly in the social sciences, because of all the mechanisms, that's the least likely, because it requires. There's cell specificity. You remember something in your hippocampus, it's going to be translated through the germline and remembered in the hippocampus of your offspring. It does seem ridiculous. But the RNA transfer is long known from maternal. There's so much information.
There's more examples in plants, but yes.
Yes, and plants also adjust the biochemistry of the seeds and so forth based on the environment. So I don't think it's totally, that there's not some sort of environmental, but the thing I want to throw back is what about genomic imprinting, parent of origin effects, which have been shown in humans. So what is the mechanism? And that might just be in every cell.
Well,
that's easier to remember than brain-specific turn this gene on or off.
Yeah, we know something about that. We even have a theory that probably explains some of it, which involves intersexual conflict and conflict between children and so forth. But there are some, not as much as in some other species like mice, but there are some, and failures of them are known to cause certain interesting genetic diseases like Engelmann syndrome and so forth. I don't know why some of them exist. Some of them look like they result from this conflict of interest. The things that, like the paternal things, are strongly expressed in the placenta, which the idea is that if you have species that's other than 100% monogamous, there's a conflict of interest between males and females. And there's a tendency for male alleles to want maximal resources devoted to this offspring, while the mother would like to give equal resources to each of her offspring. And for example, paternal alleles are overexpressed in the placenta, which is in charge of grabbing resources for the baby and so forth. I think, by the way, there's other cases that don't really fit this, but there's some at least that are probably explained by that. And I would say one reason they probably don't matter as much in humans as they do in mice is because there's a whole lot more paternal investment in humans than there is in mice.
I know the evolution is
Yes.
that suggests that there might be, I'm sure to say that before we say completely forget about it, and I'm generally on the forget about it side, that there is some mechanism for epigenetic
Oh yeah,
memory.
whether that is something that is any other than, like if you say certain alleles are always set a certain way if they're from the father, is there any more difference to that? Does it depend upon the father's experience? I know of no evidence for that at this point. As I said, it doesn't seem as common because probably humans have less conflict of interest between the sexes than mice do. Anything? Yeah.
You sounded like you would entertain starvation as a potential environment
that can be passed on.
Response to it.
But would you add more into the bucket of, what else would be in that bucket that you would at least entertain as a?
I can imagine, which is not the same as saying that I necessarily believe it, that if you have things, circumstances that affect the reproductive organs, that like starvation, which affects everything in the body, that there could be something changed which could be transmitted. Of course, the next question is whether it would ever be advantageous to do so. With plants, for example, one of the things is very often the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The correlation between environments tends to be higher for sessile organisms than for ones that move around. So it's easier to predict. It might make more sense to adjust things for the next generation. Whereas in humans, the strongest thing you could say is that good times cause famine and famine cause good times in a Malthusian world. I mean, the best way to have more to eat is if everybody's just died. A good year, a few good years, perhaps means that things are going in the other direction. Yes?
There is I think there is an epidemiologist at New York University who has data of people in the Netherlands who survived the hunger winter.
Yes.
So there you have your starvation day.
There would be lots more. We can go to China and look at the people who survived the Great Leap Forward. We could probably find a few more of them, and somewhat more recently. The other thing, the hunger winter is interesting though, because it is a short period, and it's also well understood, and there's lots of good information. We know some things, like, for example, the people who were in that year class, the draftees, they weren't any shorter, but they did have something like twice the incidence of schizophrenia, and that also happened in the Great Leap Forward, on a much more large scale, unfortunately. But there are certainly bad things that can happen. Now, this isn't the same as being transmitted in the next generation, but drastic early differences in nutrition certainly can have impacts. But yeah, that would be a place to look at, because now we would have the next generation.
The same group, by the way, now is the longest in the world.
Study the
The
longest?
average length of the people above the great rivers in Holland.
Oh yeah, they're what, 5'10" average or something?
Who are descendants, I suppose, of people who underwent the hunger winter. They are on average the longest in the world.
Because of that? Who knows?
What about big pestilences? Like bubonic plague, for example, it came kind of in waves.
The things that, I think I'm out of time, but I'll steal some. What we know is that after the Black Plague, nutrition went up because there was more
I
like.
wasn't thinking about starvation, I was thinking about another thing.
Well, the point is with the Black Plague, you see, you have to have survivors. Now, if you got the Black Plague, your chance of surviving was not very good. Now, could there have been effects among the children of the survivors? I guess it's possible, but I'll tell you that not many people survived the Black. If you got it at all, you usually died. But there would be other things, less serious, for which there could be such a thing. Now, why any of these would impact on the questions we're most interested in, basically behavioral things, it's not particularly obvious.
No, yeah.
But it's a big world.
So one
Okay.
clarification about that hunger winter. So that's Bartolome from Columbia University. And so he actually has a paper where they looked at differences in the methylation patterns, but they don't have data on the children yet. They look
Well,
at
that would be
differences-
the next step, yeah.
Yeah, but they look at differences between exposed and unexposed seedlings, and what they found is that they found differences in IGF-2-DMR between exposed and exposed seedlings, and it was like 50 years after.
I'm not
this
surprised. Well,
occurred.
like, why do you think Audrey Hepburn could keep that svelte figure? She was in.
Yeah,
She
exactly.
was
So
in
she
the
was
hunger
in
winter.
that
I mean,
hunger
not
winter.
as a baby, but she was starving in Holland at that time, and it can affect people.
And the one thing that I know is that some of those differences which were found were in imprinted genes, but then if they looked at global methylation patterns, they didn't find anything. So I mean, we don't know for sure, but at least there's promising evidence.
I'm just saying that any mechanism to me has got to be something that affects the body as a whole for it to register, because I don't think there's a special mechanism that transmits what you learn and what you think into your genes. It would be very hard to do so.